Great. So now I want to introduce Khamnei again, who is a first-year student at Columbia in the MD-PhD program. So Cole, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you introduce yourself, and then we will go ahead and take questions. You can put questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand or unmute and ask questions when there's a pause, and we'll be happy to do this. This is pretty casual. So go ahead, Cole, and thank you for being here.
Great.
And thanks everybody for showing up.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I guess my name's Cole. I graduated from Berkeley in 2019. When I was there, I studied engineering physics, and I originally wasn't pre-med. I think my junior year, I started to think about other career options, and I'd always just assumed I would be an engineer. And I'm really glad I did some soul searching and tried to figure out what I wanted to do, because I absolutely love what I'm doing right now. But after I graduated, I took 2 years and worked at the New York Genome Center doing genomics research in a lab that was affiliated with Weill Cornell Medicine. And that was kind of like a really nice opportunity for me to truly figure out if I wanted to do MD-PhD or just MD. And then it also allowed me to do some volunteering and, get my application together. And I applied, I'm not sure how the cycles work anymore, but I applied basically a year and a half ago, or maybe a full year, 2 years ago. And then I just started my first year. So I'm, I guess 9 months into my first year at Columbia. I'm in the MD-PhD program here, and my general research interests are in bioinformatics and genomics. I love to talk about that stuff, but I have a lot of friends who do all sorts of research types. So I'm happy to field questions from, about any field. Yeah. Then Joe, do you want to ask like the set of questions, or do you want to open it up to students?
I can ask a question. So first of all, talk a little bit about your journey into thinking about MD, PhD. You said you started off as engineering. How did you decide to go MD and from that and then include the PhD part of it?
Yeah. So I think for me, when I was in undergrad, I found I really liked the courses and I really enjoyed learning and the material, but I found through internships and starting to do research I did some like energy data science research. I found that I didn't love what I was doing outside of school, and I started to kind of question like what I wanted to be spending my time on. And I think compared to a lot of my friends who were also in engineering, they loved their internships and they loved their work, and it wasn't just like where they were working, it was what they were doing. And I didn't find that I had that same passion and that same like calling. I found that I liked it, but I couldn't imagine myself doing that for, a career. And so in thinking about other careers, I found that I really liked teaching, and I realized I really liked working with people. And in that process of kind of thinking about other career paths, I, talked to people who were in medicine, and specifically, family friends who were doctors or like a childhood pediatrician, and kind of learned more about what doctors do in their day-to-day and what the career paths are in that. And I think for me, I after shadowing once, I was like hooked. I was like, I really want to do this. It's just, I think it's something else to work with patients and to be like that, the person who's in charge of their care. And I think that motivated me to be pre-med. And I was really lucky that I had taken a decent amount of like chemistry classes at the beginning of my degree. So it wasn't too bad to like switch to pre-med. I just had to take some bio courses. And then in that process, I was really kind of juggling MD, PhD or not, because I think through my time at Berkeley, I enjoyed research, and I didn't want to just give up on like my interest in computer science and engineering. But I wasn't sure if I really needed to do an MD, PhD, if I wanted to commit to all the extra training and this very specific career path, when I could potentially just do, get an MD or an MDMS and do research on the side. And I really wasn't sure about what that research commitment looks like versus like how it would pan out if I only did an MD versus doing an MD-PhD. And I think that was kind of, I was able to answer that question, or at least learn a lot more about the different paths during my gap years, where I worked very closely with a lot of MD-PhDs and physician scientists. And I think I learned, like, if I learned anything from that experience, was that there's like so many different paths to become a physician scientist. And there really isn't, I wouldn't say there's necessarily a best path, but I think there are really good paths. And I think MD-PhD is one of those really good paths. It's very straightforward. And I think if you know that you want to do it from the start, it's the way to go. But many people, they get to med school or they finish their PhD or something and they realize, I want to do medicine, or they finish residency and they're like, I love research and I want to switch to becoming a physician scientist. And then I think the US healthcare system, and I think abroad, does a really great job of encouraging people who are interested in research in medicine to getting into research. And like, because it's kind of a lack of physician scientists, or there's always a need. So there's so many different training programs to get people there. And I think even now I talk to people in med school who, they're like, I should have done MD PhD. Maybe I want to transfer in, or trying to think about that. And I think it's, yeah.
Great. So there's a question. It says, this is from Masha. I'm also in a similar boat that you are in. I'm currently doing in EECS and doing research in ML in medicine. I'm really curious as to how much your medical education is helping your research in bioinformatics. I'm also curious as to how much support you have in your school and research in doing bioinformatics, as I found it's not the most common PhD path.
Yeah, I would say that's an excellent question. So it seems like there's a couple parts to that, and I would say kind of starting from the bottom and then working my way up. It's bioinformatics is definitely not the most common path. I think that among MD PhD programs, it's still not super common, but it is common. Among like MSTP programs, which are the NIH fully funded programs, that it's much more common because those are generally larger institutions with a lot more research funding. But even among them, there were some programs when I was applying that I went to their bioinformatics page, or I looked into their biomedical engineering programs, and they just didn't have a ton of faculty. It wasn't super robust. But I think pretty much all programs want to have some sort of bioinformatics PhDs in their program. Like it's a new-ish field and it's very popular. And I think the NIH is spending a lot of money funding grants. So programs really want to get students in those programs. So you have to be a little picky, or you have to do your research on programs. But I think of the programs that have an option, they're very supportive and they're very encouraging of students. Then I would say for the medical education, helping research in bioinformatics, I think this was something that I was like, I think most people would be like, does it actually help? Be suspicious of it. And I think that's very healthy. But I've been so surprised how much it actually helps. I think when I go to research talks or when I meet with people, it's like, I think even 6 months of medicine, like med school, you start to really understand what's important to a patient, what's important to the medical field. Like some things seem very important from an outsider's perspective, or maybe like some things seem very important to me as a first-year med student, and to an attending physician, they're not, because we don't necessarily see what it's like to treat patients. So getting that experience and seeing like, well, is this going to make it to clinic? Is this important? I think is really helpful. And I think it's a great skill to have. And I think, your long-term career is very helpful because it kind of allows you to write more focused grants and do more focused research on stuff that is going to be more meaningful, which is in turn going to get more funding. And I definitely wouldn't suggest anyone think about like, oh, I want to do this because of funding opportunities and this and that. Do what you like. And if the funding is there, that's great. But I think it's just, it's a nice thing to know
Question, I don't see any other questions yet in the chat. So just in terms of activities, when you were at Berkeley, can you talk about things that you did that pushed you? You talked a little bit about this, but talk a little bit more about some of the activities you took part in terms of medically related, in terms of research, how you found those different activities, what was important to you, and how you managed all of that with your coursework. Those kinds
Yeah,
of things that are like for students that are now thinking about this, kind of thinking what makes a good applicant in terms of
yeah,
what they can do.
yeah. That's a great question. I think I want to split that up into two parts, like what I did and then what I think makes a great applicant, because I think, maybe there's some overlap, but there's definitely not some overlap in certain areas. And I think, so when I was at Berkeley, I'm trying to remember the stuff I did, but I was an assistant, forget what they call them. They call them ASEs. I like helped out on a core staff for like E16A for two and a half years. And then I also volunteered at a needle exchange in Oakland. And those were, I know I had other stuff on my MCAS application, but those were the ones that like were really meaningful to me and that I remember. And outside of that, I didn't have much medical volunteering stuff. And I think that would be something that was, I think, a downside to my application. But I guess I can talk about those two a little. They were, I think, decent time commitments in addition to research. I think, being an ASC, I think it was like 6 or 8 hours a week. And then I would volunteer for like 3 hours a week and then doing research like 10, 15 hours a week. So it added up quite quickly. And I felt like sometimes it did get overwhelming, but I think it was I enjoyed all of it. And I think that was really important, was that like, with research, it was like, I enjoyed spending my time doing that. And I loved volunteering. And then, being an assistant TA, it was really fun. And I think most of my friends in med school now have very similar shared experiences that like, they really enjoyed what they were doing. And it wasn't necessarily like they were forcing themselves to do it. And I would say with the MD-PhD specifically, like it's a long, career, like training path. From start to finish, it's normally 7 or 8 years for your MD-PhD. And then with residency and fellowship, that's like, 4 to 6 years. So you're like, it's like some 15 plus years of training. And so you really got to think like, do I enjoy this? Am I getting stuff out of that? And so I would definitely suggest like, if you don't like something, don't push yourself too hard to do it, and maybe think about why you don't like it. Because if it's just this, you don't necessarily love the volunteer opportunity, that's great. You can find something else you love. But if it's maybe you don't like shadowing at all, think about why you don't like shadowing. But I also want to talk about what makes like a really good applicant in my eyes and what I've seen. And I think for the MD-PhD specific application stuff, it's a little different than MD only. I think they really want to see stellar research, and that is their biggest priority. Their priority is to train like physician scientists with a big emphasis on the scientist. And so they want to see that you've done the basics, that you've shadowed, that you've have clinical experience, that you're a nice, caring human, and all of that good stuff. But then they want to, but once you kind of hit those boxes, they become less of a selling point for MD-PhD than they would for an MD-only program. What really is the selling point is your research, and not necessarily like if you get a big paper, that's great, but really how well you understand your research too. I think in the interview process, you talk with so many people. You talk with like 3 or 4 professors at each school, and they just ask you about your research. And it's pretty easy for them to tell if you know your stuff or not. And so I think that's where you really want to focus. I think the bulk of your time is hitting the check boxes for everything else and then research. And I think for MD PhDs, it's kind of like you're going to, if you want to do a PhD and you want to spend all this time doing research, you're going you're going to meet those hours. You're going to get there. So that's not always a big worry, but I think it might be helpful to know to focus really on research and maybe not spend too much time getting like 1,000 hours of shadowing. Like that will not help you, you know, like, yeah.
Question in the chat here.
Yeah.
With MD and MD-PhD both having some research component, what would you say is the difference between MD and MD-PhD research?
Yeah, so I would say with MD research, it's generally like, it can be public health research, it could be clinical research, it can be basic science research. But in general, if your goal is to run a lab and run a basic science lab, you basically have to spend a significant amount of time doing basic science. And so if you do an MD and you do some basic science during your MD, during residency and fellowship, you're going to have to spend a ton of time doing, you know, research. So there's a much less of a focus in the MD degree. It's more of like, here's something to supplement your education, where the MD PhD is like, here's something that you're going to be focused on entirely for 3 or 4 years, and that is going to become the focus of your kind of your entire career, that you're going to be focusing on this region, like area. And for MD PhD, I would say like they pretty much, you pretty much only do your PhD in a basic science field. So like bioinformatics, while it's not necessarily basic science, it fits into that category. Whereas like, you know, running clinical studies, that you wouldn't do a PhD in that. Does that help?
I think so. There was a question I missed.
Yeah.
Sorry, Audrey.
Oh.
I noticed, here's the question. I noticed there's a lot more resources out there for applying to MD programs versus MD PhD. Was there anything about the MD PhD application process that you wish you would have known about before heading into the application process?
Yeah, definitely. There was a lot of stuff. I think, and no matter what I tell you, and no matter who you talk to, you guys will apply and be like, wow, I wish I knew this other stuff. Like all my friends felt that way. But I think the big ones that I would say is that, you know, one, connections can help a lot. I think it is astonishing how small this field is. And, you know, I think there's like 800 MD PhD students each year, which really isn't that big. And there's a handful of programs. And so if you interview at places and you apply to places, you start to know people. You start to know other students, current students, and program directors. And a lot of these program directors, they talk to the residency directors, they talk to the fellowship directors. Medicine is a small world, and you know, MD, PhD physician scientists are way smaller. And so I think you can, you know, it's good to know that, and then you can really use that to your advantage in some ways. It's like, if you have a PI that you're close with, you're doing research with, have them reach out to programs, have them say like, you know, talk to people they know, because that can help you secure an interview, that can help you get in, because programs are really, programs are really focused on getting the best people they can to their program. And if they, you know, let someone in who is a total rock star, but is not going to go to their school, that's kind of a loss for them. However, if they're able to accept someone who is, you know, they didn't think was going to go to their program, but it's also really good, they'll accept them. So stuff like letters of intent, letters of interest, having your PI reach out to people is really helpful. And I think it's like, with the caveat of, you don't want to do that to every school, and you don't want to like, you know, you don't want to lie, you don't want to mislead anyone, but you know that that is a thing, because I think I didn't realize that till like, you know, I was waiting for admissions decisions and stuff. And I had my PI actually reach out to Columbia, because I was like, I really want to go there. And he had offered in the summer when I was applying, and I was kind of like uncomfortable with it because I didn't like the idea of nepotism. And I'm very glad he did. I hope it didn't make too much of a difference in my admissions decision, but I realized that a lot of people do that. And I think if just knowing that is helpful, because it's like, don't feel bad about taking those kinds of resources. And then I think there's a lot in the application process. I think it's an enormous amount of writing. First off, like get your secondaries done before, like, or pre-write secondaries. Be ready for like places to send you way more than you expected. Like there'll be like previous years will be like 2 questions, and then they just decide to add like 5 questions. And I think also be ready to, it's a very random process that like you might be like, I'm gonna get in, or like you'd expect to get interviews and get into places of similar calibers, or maybe not, whatever. But like I have a lot of friends who, you know, kind of swept the board, got into some great places, and never heard from like other great places. And they were like, that was my top choice. And so that's why I feel like reaching out to the place is really important, because they might just be overlooking you because, you know, you seem like a great applicant, but you don't necessarily have a connection to their school. So if you give them that connection, that can make the difference. There seems to be a bunch of questions too.
Yeah. Let me go ahead and read them.
Yeah, I can read some. So, okay, the next one is, do MD-PhD admissions ask about the future research you want to pursue? Are we expected to already have honed down a really specific research interest? So it's like, the definitive answer is no, with a caveat of like, you don't need to know like, oh, I want to do single cell research for like B-cell lymphoma. You don't need to know that. If you do, great. But what you do want to know is like what field you're going to do, how it ties into medicine, and kind of like why you want to do it. I think saying like it's really interesting is helpful, but kind of justifying like the entire time in the MD-PhD application, you kind of want to justify both degrees. Why? And there's this constant question of like, why not just do an MD? Why not just do a PhD? And I don't think you need to stress too much about answering that, but having some kind of general research interest, like I want to do, you know, neuroimmunology research, great. That's like, I would say that's as specific as you need to get. And then the next one is, hi, I'm also someone who turned to the medicine, physician, scientist path later in my undergrad, and I'm wondering if you have any advice for someone who feels like they're starting a little later than many other pre-meds in terms of preparing for med school, applying to med school, especially applying to MD-PhD programs. Okay, yeah, that's a great question. I think, like I kind of said earlier, the big things are, you know, checking the boxes for pretty much everything that's not grades, MCAT, and research, and then really focusing on grades, MCAT, and research. I think you want to take the time to study well for the MCAT. With MD-PhD, a lot of the programs, the MCAT, the median MCAT's higher, and it's just like literally every program is going to be getting people who apply with like 528s and rejecting people with 528s. So like, it's not like you need this crazy high MCAT. You just don't want your MCAT to like limit you in any way. So if you're choosing like when to spend, like how much time to spend for the MCAT, I would say if you can spare an extra 2 weeks, do it because it'll pay off. And then the other thing is with people who are starting later, I think the gap year is like the potential of taking a gap year. I think talking to people and seeing like, is my application ready? And if it's not, take a gap year and find a research either at Berkeley or like any large institution with a medical school will be really helpful. I think, and you'll be exposed to like different people. You'll get great mentorship, and that can be, I think, what really makes or breaks applications. I know for me, like I had to take gap years. I wouldn't have gotten in if I didn't. And I would say don't be afraid of gap years. I think some people are, but with MD-PhD, I think the median. I think most people take, or like the median people take 1 gap year. So it's very common for people to take 1, 2, or 3 gap years before coming to MD-PhD. It's, I would say, a little less common for straight through, but it still happens. yeah, then this is, oh, did I also apply to medical school? Yeah, so I applied to 3 medical schools. So I'm originally from Vermont, and the University of Vermont doesn't have an MD-PhD program. So I applied to just MD-PhD there. And then I applied to 2 other programs in Boston, Tufts and BU. I don't actually know why I applied, but they didn't have MD-PhD. And so, I think Tufts didn't have bioinformatics, and BU, it wasn't paid for. And I was just like, I want to add schools because I'm scared. And yeah, but I think most people apply pretty much exclusively to MD-PhD. But if you have a reason like, oh, I'd rather go to this place, MD only, do it. There's no harm in throwing it on your list. Then next question. Out of curiosity, when did you take the MCAT? Do you think it makes a difference if one takes it in their gap year? Master's in place. Okay, so for the MCAT, I don't think it doesn't make a difference when you take it. The only thing is when you're applying, I think you have to have taken your MCAT within 3 years. And so I would say, so you have to take it within 3 years of applying. So if you take it too early and you take a bunch of gap years, you might have to retake it. The other thing is, I would say when you're working, it can be tough to study. So I took my MCAT, I think senior year, winter break. And so it was like 4 weeks of studying, and it was like pretty crammed. So if I had like 2 more weeks, I think it would have been much nicer. But I would suggest it's sometimes nice if you can take time before starting a job and do your MCAT then or during school breaks. Then master's in place of a gap year. Yeah, that's super common. I think it's like, I definitely think about what you want. I think with MD-PhD, a master's versus working in a lab, if you're being productive in both, it's not going to be a big selling point for the master's. Maybe if it helps your GPA in some way. But I think it's kind of like a thing in medicine, or just maybe academia, like your terminal degree kind of trumps your lower degree. So if you get like a PhD, no one really cares about your MS. But plenty of people do it. Then NIH has good post-background. It does. I have one of my friends went there and he had a great time. Did you have to defend your med school apps to MD-PhDs? No. So med schools can't see where you've applied to or who else you've applied to. I wouldn't bring it up. I wouldn't, but no. Yeah. Then yeah. Okay.
There's a question. I think you skipped. What would you say is a good MCAT score?
Oh yes, that is a good question. So I think the median is a 516. I think it really depends on where you want to go, what you want to do. I would say anything above a 520 puts you in shooting distance of every school, which is great. I would say there are some schools that have incredibly high MCAT scores. So I think Penn has their median MCAT's like a 522, maybe 523, which is like kind of insane. And I think that makes it hard because it's obviously like you got to be in the 100th percentile to be even above average of the applicants. But I would say if you're anywhere in the 510 above range, start thinking about it. I think it's also about thinking about what schools fit your research interests and stuff like that. Because I think it's just hard because there's so many people applying and it's really competitive. So yeah, I think that's I would say it's one of the subjects where I would never want to say don't apply or don't do something because of a bad score. I would say talk to people and figure out either retake it or figure out what you can do to really help your application. Because I think exceptional research, exceptional anything can overcome that and then really understanding what schools are like, what their range is. I just wouldn't, yeah, like I wouldn't, if you were got like a 500, I wouldn't expect to get into Penn. Like if you're not within their kind of bottom 10% or 90%, or at least close to that, there's a chance. There's probably no chance. Yeah. Let's see the next question. Oh, UCSF has a relatively new postbac program called Pell. Oh, that's great. I would say one thing is like schools really do like hearing about other experiences as well. There's a, you know, MD-PhDs specifically there is a whole class of grants for URM MD-PhDs. And so it's like really good and really helpful. So I think for my friends who are URM here, like they really recommended seeking out those resources early because there's a ton of things to help. I don't know much about them, but I would say don't let, be on the lookout for those. When you were an undergrad, how did you get your start in research? Were all research experiences positive topics you enjoyed? Had you find PIs who were also good mentors for letters? That's a great question. I would say, so I don't remember how I ended up getting involved in my research. I did research in I don't remember, it might have been energy engineering department. I didn't have a great experience with my research at Berkeley. It was, I was working with a grad student and the PI was nice, but I never got one-on-one time with him. I didn't really get any mentorship in that sense. And when I was, looking for letters of rec, it became a big hassle. I guess when I hadn't talked to the grad student for a year and I assumed we were on good terms, and we were, but he had a falling out with his PI. And it just was like not what I wanted to deal with when I was going through all that stress. And so kind of that experience really made me kind of selective for what I was looking for my gap year work. And the PI I ended up working with, like, he really wanted me to do MD-PhD, and he was a very supportive mentor. Like I said, he like wrote program, like he was like, what are your top choices? Like, I'll reach out to the PDs. And I think you want to kind of gauge a PI's support for you, because they're getting a lot from you and they might not let on, but like you're doing a lot of research for them, and chances are you're getting paid a lot for that work. And so what you want to get out of that is a stellar letter of rec. And so most of my letters of rec for research were from my job. I felt like a clinical fellow that I worked very closely with. And then my boss was an MD-PhD. Then I know some programs require letters of rec from all PIs. The research experiences you list. Yeah, research mentor who you're not sure if they would write a great letter of rec. Would you recommend even mentioning the research experience? Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it depends on how significant that research experience is to your career. I think I did a month of research at UCSF, or not a month, a semester of research at UCSF, like my freshman year. And I didn't even remember. I remember the PI's name, but I was not in contact with her anymore. And I put it on my MCAS, I'm not sure, but it wasn't significant enough to be like, I think for the schools that asked you to explain, I was just like, I'm not in contact with them, and that was fine. But if they had asked me to leave it off, it wouldn't have really mattered. I think it's more like if it's one of your core research experiences, trying to figure out, like, can you get a letter of rec from a postdoc? Can you work with that mentor to understand, like, that this is really important and gauge how they're going to write the letter? Because I think if it's good, that's fine. You obviously don't want them to write anything bad, and you don't want them to write something that's really lukewarm. So when I was asking for letters of rec from courses, I asked, like, there was one person who was like, I can write you an okay to good, better, or rec. And I chose not to use them because I was like, thank you. Like, it was really helpful for him to tell me that because I was like, thanks. Like, so being selective with that is important. Then I've heard MD-PhD programs are more focused on research. Given the pandemic and limited opportunities, do you think lots of research can compensate for minimal virtual? Yes, I think so. I would say you don't want to go about doing that. I think it's like, I think everyone has like varying levels of how much is a lot of clinical research or experience. I would say shooting for 20 plus hours of shadowing and then 50 to 100 of some kind of clinical volunteering is really good, because then you can just kind of, I don't think that's going to be the killer in an application. Like, you're not going to get your application thrown out because of that stuff. You might if you have zero. I know I had very little, and I got a call from one of the PDs at a school, like, do you have clinical experience? And I was like, well, I put what I wrote on my application. And she was like, okay, well, anything else? And I was like, no. And I never heard from that school. And so it's just like, you don't want it to limit yourself. So I know it's very challenging in the pandemic, but just trying to hit, a minimum is will make your life easier. Then someone asked, okay. Oh yeah, let's see. As someone who had to take the pre-med requirements and the engineering CS coursework, can you share your experience with how you managed to keep a good GPA? And as you enjoy, do you have advice on how to make the most out of the weeder STEM classes? Yeah, so I think I would say the hardest courses to keep a good GPA for me was Bio 1A and like the other kind of pre-med courses, because I think those have a much lower median GPA. And I would say really focusing your effort on getting the A's in that course, those courses, is important. In managing it all, I'm honestly trying to remember because, yeah, I think, honestly, I can't really remember. It's been at this point 3 years since I took a class for a grade. I think it was just like, it stressed me out to not do well, and that stress motivated me. That's why I really enjoy pass no pass classes, because it's a lot less stressful. Yeah. Do they care about non-basic science research at all? Yes, and it really depends. So if you're doing if you're like a clinical research coordinator, I don't think that will add much to your application. It will add a lot to an MD application, but like an MD only, but not, yeah. Yeah, it doesn't hurt, but what they really want to see is a basic science interest. So if you have clinical stuff on top of it, that's great.
Well, before we get too far along, whatever techniques you're using for studying now, are those the same techniques you use for studying in undergrad? Is it similar in a way, what you're doing now as you are in medical school?
It's somewhat similar. So the way I studied in undergrad was, a lot of my courses were problem set based. So I would work through the problem sets, and but I get that probably doesn't apply to a lot of people. For the pre-med courses, I think with chemistry, I really took the time to try and understand what was going on and not just try and memorize it. Because I think that's something where if the professor wants to throw you a curveball test, memorizing it might not help you, but kind of if you put the extra time to really understand it, that'll help. But I would say, I don't know, I didn't use Anki in undergrad. That's like a big med school thing. Probably half the kids here use Anki. I've used it a bit here. And for those who don't know, it's like a kind of a more advanced Quizlet. It's like a note card thing. I think if I were to do it again, I would definitely use Anki for like bio, maybe biochem, probably the MCAT, just to be able to have all that information in one place and cycle through it. Yeah, but I would suggest also finding a good study habit, like when you guys are in school, is great, because then it'll be super helpful in med school. Yeah. Oh, office hours were good. Yeah, that's a great place to like meet people, talk for or get to know the PI for letters of rec. Yeah.
Okay. Another question down there.
Oh, yes. What is your med school life like? Do you just do class and other things as well? Yeah, so I would say it's really nice, actually. So Columbia does like lecture based for the most part. Like we have small groups for an hour and a half, like 3 to 5 days a week. And so I'll go in person to those. But then for the lectures, I generally don't go when I watch them at home, just because like I like to sleep in till like 9:30. And I would say as a whole, I'm busy. Like I feel like I have to use a Google Calendar or else I have no idea what's going on with my life. But I just kind of look at my calendar and say, okay, I'm doing these things. And then if I have a break, I either, go grocery shopping or go exercise or climb or do whatever or study. So I would say it's very chaotic. And I felt like my undergrad life was like that because your schedule is kind of weird. So, but it's really nice because I think you can really schedule your life how you want to. And if you want to take a weekend off, you can do that. If you want to go like take weekdays off to go travel or do something, you can do that. And I think it's just all about like learning how much you need to do to get to where you want. So like the tests are pass and pass, and obviously you want to pass, but you might want to do a little more than that if you really like the specialty or you just want to have a good understanding of the material. And I think after the first block, which was like 5 weeks, I kind of figured out what I needed to do. And that enabled me to be like, yeah, I'm going to take this week off and the next week's going to be hell. But that's how I like to live my life. Like I get to enjoy, a full week to do something or, yeah.
Just let me interrupt here just one moment. Guys, I'm going to post a poll that we need to put in here. It's very quick, just 3 questions. So I'm just going to post it in here and answer it, and that's it. So just go for it. We can go ahead and keep talking. Sorry, Cole.
Okay, no worries.
I need to do.
I'm going to put no knowledge gained for all of these questions. No worries. But I would say also in terms of lifestyle, most med students seem everyone's like doing something, and I think it's very encouraging. So I think most people get involved in some kind of free clinic or volunteering opportunity or research. So at this point, I'm kind of doing all of those, and it's kind of just nice to start working on stuff that you like to do because you like to do it and not necessarily doing it for an application. But then any advice on applying to Columbia's PhD program in particular? Was more. Yeah, so I would say I don't really think about MD-PhD programs as too different from each other. I think different schools have really different like focuses and like are really strong in certain areas. So, if you're interested in neuro research and you really like knocked it out of the park and you want to go to a big neuro institution, like Columbia would be a great place for you. Like UCSF would be a great place for you. I think I wouldn't say it's too different. I know a lot of Columbia students are like, they have a lot of interest, and that was what kind of drew me to Columbia was I really liked how the students were engaged in their community and then also just did things for fun, like a lot of different things for fun. And that was nice. It made me think like, oh, they are able to live like a somewhat normal life and they're not just studying. And I was really worried in the months leading up, like, was I like, lied to? Is this going to be the case? And then once I started, I was really glad to see that that was the case. But from friends at other schools, I think I wouldn't say Columbia is unique in that aspect, but it did stand out to me. How did you come to terms with the very long training required in MD-PhD programs? Are there things that you had to give up / how do you balance school with other things you want to do? Yeah, so there's kind of two questions there. Yeah, it's a lot to come to terms with. And I think for me, it's like, I like what I'm doing now. And I think it's like starting to be like, hey, if you're enjoying your PhD time, obviously you'd like to make more money. Obviously you'd like to potentially work less, but if you're enjoying it, it doesn't necessarily feel like a long time. Like it's just like you're working a job. And so for me, it really feels like a job. And I think that's helped me a lot. And for my mentors and older students, it seems like that attitude has helped them kind of survive it, because it's like you work your job for the rest of your life. You don't till you retire. So you're not thinking like, oh, this is 8 years of job. You're thinking, or you're not thinking, yeah. But then other things you have to give up, and how do you balance school with other things? Yeah, so there are definitely things that you have to give up. Like I do feel, and I think with med school, that'll be the case. Like you really have to put more effort into being there for important things. And I think like that is going to be the case in medicine your entire life. Like you have to, if something's important to you, you have to put the effort to be there for like the people in your life or show up to that event. And I found it's just hard. Like I have found like when there's an exam and I'm studying really hard and I haven't called my mom in like 2 weeks, I have to take the time to be like, I'm going to call her, because anyone in medicine will tell you that. That's tough one. Then balancing school with other things, I think it's just, again, choosing what's important. To me, like climbing and biking and getting outside are really important. But, other things are like reading. I like reading, but it's not as important as those other things, so I just don't read. Then, do you have a lot of financial concern in the program, or do they support you enough to focus on things? I think they support me enough. I think it's like, it's kind of funky because Columbia's in New York City. New York City is very expensive, but you guys know expensive stuff because Berkeley is extremely expensive. I think it's enough to live comfortably, but not excessively. But it's not enough to start like acting like it's a job. Like, I don't think you can start putting away savings for your retirement or for like a house or anything like that. Like my friends are doing that, but I'm not. And I think it's kind of like, I tell myself like, well, once I'm out of residency, like the salary, like the money's all going to work out. It's going to be okay. And for right now, I'm doing fine. Yeah.
What is your ultimate goal in research? Do you have an area that you really want to go into?
Yeah, I think that's, for me, I'm like very interested in kind of data science and machine learning applied to medicine or applied to medical topics. And so far, I've really loved genomics. I find it really interesting. And genomics fits very well with oncology or infectious diseases. And so I'm interested in both of those specialties. But we recently had our neurology block, and I was like totally blown away. I really enjoyed that. So that might throw a wrench into things, but I think ultimately, like being able to spend time developing methods, like computational methods, to apply for clinical stuff is my goal.
Yeah, well, that's great. And you get that opportunity to choose within this first couple of years. Can you kind of talk a little bit about how they expect you to decide on your research area?
Yeah, so most programs have you do a couple of research rotations. So you can do one before you start med school. So you do like 8 weeks before you start med school. I chose not to do that because I left my job in May and I was like, I just want to relax for 3 months. But then this summer I'll be doing a research rotation. And then after I finish my preclinical education next January, I will take step 1 and then do 2 clinical rotations and then do another research rotation. So it's really these research rotations where you get to figure out what PIs you want to work with, narrow down on what research you want to do. And generally, I think people take 1 to 2. And the school, at least Columbia's, like the program directors are very supportive, and they talk to you about like who might be a good mentor, who hasn't been a good mentor in the past, who to avoid, who has enough funding, and all sorts of those kind of like very important details that as a student you might not know.
Are you in a cohort with other MD-PhD students that have become like your group?
Yeah. So there's 14 students in my year, and it's pretty nice because like it felt like kind of one of like the Berkeley colleges. I guess the colleges at Berkeley are very big, but like maybe like CNR or like College of Chemistry, where like you're in this big school and then you have this much smaller program. And our class are like the MD plus MD-PhD classes, I think 140 students. And then within it, there's the 14 MD-PhD students. So like, it really feels like we get all these extra benefits. We get to hang out with these people, and it's, I wouldn't say we're like super tight, but we're friends, and that's really nice.
Yeah, but you also intermix with the MD students as well.
Yeah.
Good.
Very much.
You're taking classes, you're taking your basic science, your basic first classes with them.
Yeah. The only difference is like for the first year and a half, it's exactly the same, except for the summer where you have to do research, but you don't have to apply for grants. So like my MD friends are stressing about getting their grants, and like, well, we got the money, but yeah.
Good. All right. Any other questions? You guys have been a great audience with great questions. Thank you so much. Anything else? Are you willing, Cole, to, if students want to contact you, to be contacted?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I can. Do you want me to put my email in the chat, or will you?
It's up to you.
Okay, I'll put my Berkeley email because I do check that regularly. And yeah, feel free to send me an email. I'm happy to answer any questions about MD-PhD or MD in general. Yeah.
Great. Well, perfect. Well, if there's no more questions, we're pretty much at time. Let me just stop the recording.